Associated Press reports the Trump administration has waived FBI fingerprint checks for caregivers and mental health workers at a teen migrant camp in Texas. A Health and Human Services memo published Tuesday says none of the more than 2,000 staffers at the tent city in Tornillo, Texas, go through fingerprint background checks. The camp is currently holding more than 2,300 teens in what was intended to be a temporary shelter. For more on this developing story, we bring in Martha Mendoza. She is a co-author of the report. Martha, it's so great to have you with us. Can you please remind our viewers why this camp was built in the first place?
Yeah, the camp was built not to house kids who were separated from their families at the border, but because of that policy. So when the Trump administration began separating kids from their parents at the border, those kids displaced other children who had come into the United States on their own trying to reach their relatives. These are mostly teenagers, and subsequently it became harder under new immigration policies to reunite kids with their families once they had entered. And so at this point there's a record 14,000 kids in federal detention, migrant kids. And so they just needed an emergency place to put them.
So it seems that this camp just ballooned much more quickly than administrators were prepared for. Before we get into the details of that, what is the cost, roughly, of maintaining this camp?
It's ballooning as well. The costs at this point can reach as much as $1,200 per child per night. This year, we may end up, as taxpayers, spending $430 million for this camp at Tornillo.
Incredible. And we're getting caregivers who haven't had background checks for that taxpayer money. So let's talk a little bit about that. Why would Health and Human Services release this memo if they knew they would receive some pushback?
So this is an agency within the Department of Health and Human Services called the Office of Inspector General, and their job is to be a watchdog over their own agency. And in this case, they were very aggressive and said, you know, hey, you are taking care of these kids and you're not doing it appropriately. You're not even meeting our own requirements. So, not only were they, go ahead.
So how did they find all of these workers? So if these workers did not go through the proper channels for background checks, were they just putting up signs on, you know, on light posts and saying we've got jobs? How were they recruiting these workers?
The workers are all employed by subcontractors. The key subcontractor running the Tornillo detention camp is called BCFS, Health and Human Services, and it's a faith-based nonprofit that typically will pop up a big shelter. Let's say there's a hurricane and people need a place to stay overnight. And so they, in an emergency, don't have time to do FBI background checks. And this place was set up as an emergency. So in part, the Office of Refugee Resettlement thought that the contractor would be doing some kind of checks. And they say they are doing some kind of checks, but they're not doing fingerprint checks. And those matter because that's how you can tie a name to a person if someone has some sort of abuse or neglect record in their past.
And especially when you're dealing with caregivers to minors, correct?
Yes, and you know, minors who are in a big detention center are a draw for would-be predators or people who want to traffic children. This is a place where they might be tempted to go try to get a job. The jobs were advertised online, you know, on typical job sites.
So you write also that the federal government is allowing the nonprofit running the facility to, quote, sidestep the mental health care requirement. So let's talk about that piece of it. How many mental health experts are required to be on hand for a certain number of children?
Typically, it's 1 to 12 if the kids are considered to be in kind of a decent situation. If they're not high-needs kids, it's 1 to 12. Again, because this was an emergency shelter in June, that requirement was waived. It's also in a very remote place, and to find hundreds and hundreds of clinician-level mental health care providers is near impossible. They need to have a master's degree, and this is, you know, in the desert 40 miles south of El Paso.
And so you wrote that there's now a mental health expert per each 100 child, more or less?
Their contract allows them 1 per 100. When we spoke with them most recently, they said it's 1 per 50.
And it sounds to me like these children probably, you know, are somewhat traumatized. I mean, they're separated from their families wherever they may be. They've traveled great distances. They probably would need more than the average health care a provider?
Yeah, people who work with teenagers and who work with stressed out teenagers all say they need much more support, mental health care support. They have been through a very, very difficult and stressful time. And part of adding to their stress is they don't know when they're going to be able to see their family members who are here in the United States. They're unclear on when they're getting moved from one shelter to another.
Well, let's talk about that, because so many of these teens traveled to the U.S. to find their family members, right? They already have families in the U.S. So why is it so hard to reunite them? You think it certainly would cost the taxpayer less if they left these facilities and were reunited with those families?
Yes. Ironically, the sponsors or family members are now having to undergo rigorous background checks that are taking much longer than they used to. And so that's why these cases drag on for weeks and even months. Some of the kids have been at Tornillo since June. Even
though they're in contact with family members?
They get to make 2 10-minute calls a week, because these clinicians, these mental health specialists, are the ones who facilitate those calls. So they're also short-staffed on that.
Goodness. Martha Mendoza, thank you so much for your reporting on this very important topic.